Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Magas. This is not real life, and welcome to my review on Streets of Rage 4. At first, I was worried about if this kind of game could still be viable today. Yes, I loved the first and dabbled in the other two, but that was some 20 plus years ago. 20 years. Think about that. Yeah, I am older than some of you out there, and it has been some time since I've played this kind of game. Streets of Rage has a simple premise. A crime boss is running unchecked, and three cops decide enough's enough and take matters into their own hands. Literally. And so, Streets of Rage, the series begins. There is something primal in solving your problems with your fists, and that's part of the appeal of Streets of Rage. We've come a long way since the original Streets of Rage back in 1991. Will this brawl be just what we need to shake off the rust from the franchise? Or will nostalgia fade away to show us a game better left to yesteryear? Join me as I review Streets of Rage 4. To the best of my understanding, the plot is as follows. Don't worry, I'll keep this spoiler free. Streets of Rage 4 takes place 10 years after the previous game. Having defeated Mr. X, the overlord of a powerful crime syndicate, it looks like our heroes all went on their own separate ways. Axel Stone decides to go full Ryu and retires from the police force and decides to live in the woods to train and meditate on what true strength is. Blaze Fielding, apparently having been fired for anger management issues after punching her boss, now teaches dance and does choreography for local productions. She, however, keeps her detective instinct and catches on to dealings as a new syndicate emerges. She begins reaching out to old contacts to get help to investigate and, if necessary, put down this new criminal uprising. The last of the original trio, Adam Hunter, who is now a father, originally wished to retire to care for his daughter Cherry. However, he was assigned to a special task force to infiltrate the syndicate and appears to have disappeared. Cherry, now a musician, responds to Blaze's call to action to look for her missing father. Blaze then reached out to Dr. Gilbert Zan, a robotics engineer specializing in cybernetics. Formerly employed by Mr. X's syndicate, he was betrayed by them, and as a result, he was forced to use his expertise on himself. This led him to contacting Blaze to get revenge, and he was instrumental in taking down Mr. X. Since then, he has been helping people to atone for his previous misdeeds, and that is where the newest member of the team comes in. Rounding out this group is Floyd Uraya, a former construction worker who has lost his arms in a tragic work accident. Abandoned by his former employers, Floyd eventually meets and is helped by Dr. Gilbert Zan, who takes him in as an apprentice. Presumably, Dr. Zan is either too old or has taken a vow of non-violence, and instead Floyd decides to answer the call on his behalf. Rumors have it that this new organization is being run by Mr. X's own children, who have adopted the moniker the Y Twins. The organization is described as an empire and is corrupting the city and has destroyed the peace that Wood Oak has enjoyed for the last 10 years. The team investigates and slowly discover the twins are planning something big. The reason I say, to the best of my understanding, is that the story in Streets of Rage 4 isn't that clear-cut. The opening crawl gives you the bare bones of what I just went over, and in the game comic book style cutscenes also give you what you need to follow along, but there are big gaps, and the story will keep trucking along regardless. Between the game itself, what the character bios say, and some additional information from the Streets of Rage wiki, this is the plot as best as I've been able to reconstruct it. Cherry's inclusion in particular is not specified in the game. Her bio mostly details how she's been trying to get out of her father's shadow. The Mr. X Nightmare DLC does add a bit to the story, seen here, but there isn't any addition to the main story mode. Instead, the plot provides a framework for why survival mode exists in the universe. I think this is a nice touch, as I imagine most players will probably bypass the screen or forget that they read it. If the plot of Streets of Rage 4 reminds you of a late 80s, early 90s action flick, or for some of the older reviewers out there, your favorite Saturday morning cartoon, this isn't an accident. However, I find that its minimalist presentation made it hard to get invested in the story. And sadly, I would often get the urge to skip cutscenes even during my first time viewing it. Sure, we can say that we're not here for the story, but that's kind of a cop-out, as that's what helps us get invested in the characters. The environmental storytelling in the levels themselves is good, but this doesn't always relate to the plot directly. You may find yourself confused as to why the characters are going from place to place, as the only thing you discover, as a player, is your fist in the face of your enemies. Newcomers to the series, and those of us who are not the most dedicated of fans, will be confused by references or just plain miss them. An example of this for me was the realization that Streets of Rage had advanced cybernetics and robotics. Having only really played the first game, this part of the lore was totally new to me. I just figured, hey, that's pretty cool, and thought that's why it was suddenly in the game, not knowing that it had long been established. This bare bones approach was likely done to preserve the feel of these old games, as beat-em-ups rarely have any cutscenes save for the victory screen at the end. And the homage to the original is clearly important to the developers, but ultimately it feels like a missed opportunity, as the very dedication to the originals may be holding the game back in this regard.
Hababa, hababa, hababa.
For those of you who are unfamiliar with beat-em-ups, you won't really need to learn multiple movesets just to play all the characters. While most of what you do is fighting, this is not a fighting game per se, at least as far as video game genres are concerned. Most of what you do is beat up thugs, hence the name. This is an old school genre, and your only instructions are go right and beat them up. Aside from that, you'll also find interactable objects like trash cans, chairs, boxes that will house weapons or one of three kinds of items. These are money, food, and stars. So if you see someone, beat them up. If they get back up, beat them up some more. And once you get to the end of the level, you'll fight a boss and progress to the next one. So how exactly do you beat up people? I'm glad you asked, hypothetical viewer. As stated earlier, the button inputs for all the characters is the same. If this is your first time playing, take a moment to familiarize yourself with the Fighting Tips option of the main menu. I find this title misleading, as it is not a collection of tips on how to play better, but rather a bunch of how to play screens strung together. This is also available from the pause menu. Keep in mind, while the commands are the same for all the characters, the resulting action they perform is not always the same. Where one character will do a body slam, another may throw their enemy. Some have totally unique traits, like the ability to run or to carry enemies around. These variations among the characters cover everything from damage dealt per blow, to walk speed, and jump height. So experiment till you find the character you like. You can also see a breakdown of the stats for each character on their bio screen. The combo system is pretty straightforward. Continuously pound in the faces of enemies and you'll rack up hits. The greater the number, the bigger the text on screen. The levels of the combo are also color-coded and the word changes according to each level. Fighting game enthusiasts will recognize this UI element from every fighting game ever. However, the difference here being if you get hit, you break the combo and have to start over. Why does this matter? Well, the greater the combo, the more points you earn as a result. Each successive level has its own multiplier that is applied to the score of the hits you do. This is important if you want to get those S ranks on stages, if you want to get extra lives or stars, because those are unlocked by hitting certain point thresholds. Another old school mechanic that returns is the risk-reward system associated with special moves. Using any special moves will temporarily drain your health. This health loss can be considered temporary, as you can regain the lost health by successfully attacking enemies. Different moves regenerate this in different amounts, and it seems to be related to the damage of the attack. If you are hit though, before you recover that health, you will take the damage of the hit and all the stored damage of the green bar. At this point, you would need a health item to recover your health. Note that if you have recoverable damage and eat a food item, you will regenerate the health amount and push the recoverable damage. Another staple of these games returns in the friendly fire feature. Thankfully, this can be toggled on and off in the character select screen, but not in the options menu once the game is active. If you're not aware, the game sets this on by default, which means you can accidentally, or perhaps purposefully, attack your teammate while in a multiplayer game. This is not true for star moves, but regular moves and specials count. Personally, I prefer to play with this off, But if you want an experience true to how the games used to be, give it a try. If you turn it off, just be aware that while you cannot hurt your teammates, you may still obstruct them as you cannot pass through each other. In the original Streets of Rage, you could also throw teammates for a team-up attack of sorts, and since I've played with this off, I actually did not confirm if this is still there in the game. Full disclosure, I also did not play any of the online modes as I prefer to play solo or on couch co-op, which I did spend a lot of time doing. The roots of Streets of Rage 4 are in old school video games, and all old school games had one very notable limitation: memory. For those of you too young to know, for example, old Sega Genesis games usually maxed out about 4 megabytes of data. While there are exceptions that I'm sure are larger, that's basically the data of one song or audio file today, and some audio files can dwarf even that. So developers typically had to make do with limited resources. As a result, one of the most brilliant bits of game development was created: the palette swap. This appears to be marginalized today because most games today make us think we've passed this memory threshold issue. The palette swap allows developers to reuse existing assets and save on space, as the visuals took up a lot of the processing power. Those unfamiliar with this nomenclature will likely recognize the modern equivalent of skin swapping. So, in games like Streets of Rage that needed loads of enemies, but maybe not a whole lot of processing power was available, enemies would be recolored and introduced as newer, tougher versions of previous enemies. This isn't just in that it takes more damage to kill them, they also are programmed with different and more difficult to predict behavior. And as a revitalization of a classic game, the palette swap methodology remains in Streets of Rage 4. All non-boss enemies have this method of designating rank. Enemies will also have different names, but within a character type they will all utilize some sort of naming theme that unifies them all. The bulk of the difficulty of Streets of Rage 4 will actually come from this and in the amount of enemies and the mix of enemies that you are facing. As things progress, enemies will become more difficult as they gain more abilities. Some of these include the ability to use weapons, the abilities to grab, or to even have temporary armor that prevents them from being stunned. Aside from this, there are a few environmental dangers as well. These range from those caused by said enemies, interactable weapons or stage elements, and even pitfalls. Note that enemy behaviors actually do not change on easier difficulties, it's just that there are less enemies in general. But on higher difficulties, obviously you face more enemies, and as a result you may butt up against moves you hadn't seen before that have special properties. Finally, pay attention to flashing enemies. Flashing is an indicator of specific attacks. If an enemy is flashing red, it means they're going to attempt to throw you. If they're flashing white, it means they and their attack cannot be interrupted. This latter one is usually reserved for bosses. The palette swapping technique is taken even further in the Mr. X's Nightmare DLC, survival mode specifically, where even bosses can get this treatment.
Emotional damage!
The game starts with 4 playable characters and 1 hidden character who is unlocked in the main story mode. The Mr. X Nightmare DLC adds an additional 3 playable characters. All the stat information and some short bios can be found in the extras under the character information, and this shows all of the playable characters and their old school variations if applicable. There are actually a lot of unlockable characters in Streets of Rage. For the most part, you'll be able to unlock every playable character in the series thus far. This comes from the form of just about every iteration of every character from every game. Initially, I had a little bit of confusion as I actually started this process before the DLC came out, and certain characters you met in the game who I assumed were playable were not, but they had iterations that were. This is actually later remedied with the DLC pack, and it left only one very suspiciously unique sprite who exists in a certain bar as the only non-playable character from the series. Unlocking characters is pretty easy and doesn't require any specific feats or achievements. Simply playing the game and racking up a huge lifetime score will unlock all the characters eventually. I believe it's around the 2 million point mark when everything is unlocked for the base game. The points you earn are cumulative and unlock the classic iterations of the characters and concept art. Playing story unlocks the harder difficulties when you complete the highest one available to you. And in the DLC, survival mode specifically, you get the ability to unlock new moves for each character which are usable outside of survival once unlocked. Those of you who are completionist minded will undoubtedly unlock everything, but I just settled for unlocking the moves of just the modern characters. So, I didn't pay very much attention to the marketing material before the game came out. I had no idea that this feature I'm going to tell you about was here, and actually discovered it by accident. In fact, an enemy revealed the secret for me. So, hidden in Streets of Rage 4 are 4 special hidden classic levels. Each one, when activated, sends you to a retro level from a previous game, pixels and all, where you face off against a former boss not present in the game otherwise. I won't spoil how to access them or reveal their locations, but just be on the lookout for oddly placed interactable items. If and when you find them, feel free to go into the secret level, as it's a free pass for more points. Any lives lost in the hidden level doesn't affect the main game, and you get more points and items for completing them. The Mr. X's Nightmare DLC also gives you new modes and difficulties to keep the game fresh. The strongest of these is the survival mode, where you will practically have infinite replay value. One final note on gameplay is that you may notice at times there are weird, let's call them hiccups, due to perspective. This was present back in the day and it's still here. You can literally be just out of range or just out of line with an enemy and get pummeled by them, but all your attacks are gonna whiff. And some enemy attacks will always connect and hit you if you are in the right conditions. Sometimes this can feel unfair, but this is actually an artifact of an older kind of game and it has been faithfully recreated. Hopefully these kinds of things will be updated in Streets of Rage 5, but we'll have to wait and see on that. So, it turns out I actually had nothing to fear when it came to the viability of beat 'em up games. I actually initially thought the asking price for the game was a bit high, but now that I've played it, and I can see that there's an insane amount of replay value. Just getting through all the levels, unlocking everybody, playing on every difficulty, working on S ranks, and finally score chasing on leaderboards. Streets of Rage 4 will keep you playing for a long time. And that doesn't even include the modes added in the DLC. Heck, this is the longest Streets of Rage game ever, based solely on the number of levels. Streets of Rage 4 has reignited my love for the franchise, and I'm looking forward to the next installment of the series. This is a must-play for any beat 'em up fans. For those of you who aren't really into old school games or only play AAA games, this will probably register as a, I'll get that with Game Pass or PlayStation Plus kind of game. But for me, this game is a definite must-play, full-price game. Hopefully, this causes a resurgence in beat 'em ups and inspires other developers to go out and make this kind of game. To all the people at Lizard Cube, Dotemu, and Guard Crush, and Sega, awesome job, perfect, awesome job. And thanks for taking the time, the effort, and the dedication to make this game right. Well, thank you so much for watching this review of Streets of Rage 4. If you like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you can stay up to date on these videos, and so YouTube will share it with others. If you really like this video, perhaps consider donating to my Patreon. Link below so I can make this kind of a full-time thing and get these videos out more frequently. I'm Ross Magas. This is Not Real Life, and I'll see you guys in the next video.